we'll get started tonight, and we'll get into our study. Father, thank you for tonight and for all that you've done for us. Thank you for your word. Lord, thank you for the people that you've Lord, you tell us that when two or three of us are gathered, you're here in the midst of us. And Lord, in the time of disputes, you're there, but Lord, also in the time when we can agree in your word. And we thank you so much that you've given us your word and we can trust it. Lord, you've preserved it for us, and we know that these things are going to happen, and we look forward to them happening. We ask that you bless our study in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, we've got over enough background. We can finally get into some of what we're actually going to be studying. And so really it kind of starts with our different key passages that we'll look at. There's kind of three main passages. There's other passages too in the Old Testament that deal with that time period, but these three passages kind of deal with, I guess you could say, everything that's going on. And so if you think of it as an outline, which is often how I think of it, usually when you write an outline for school or something else, maybe you can read it, maybe you can't. Get your binoculars out, read it a little bit closer. But like when you're writing a paper, for example, you'll have your main points, and your main points are kind of short, sweet, to the point. Then you'll have your subpoints, and if you have a letter A, you have to have a letter B, all that stuff. Right? And your subpoints might be a little bit more detailed for your main points, and then you have your subpoints, which are your ones and twos, and maybe you have little A's and little B's and all that. But all that stuff is more detailed information the further down your outline you get. How many of you did that in school? Like 3 of you. Wow. Did the rest of you go to school? No, we didn't have schools back then, did we? So in school you learn how to write a paper, you learn how to write an outline, and you have your main points when you write a paper. You kind of have your thesis statement, right? Your main thing you're trying to prove, and your points will prove your main thing. Well, the Bible works similarly. When you kind of have in Daniel 9:27, you kind of have your main points, right? It talks about how this prince will come, he'll make a covenant. In the midst of the covenant, kind of your point 2, and your point 3 is the consummation at the very end. And then in Jesus' day, he, in Matthew 24 and 25, give more details to those events, where he'll kind of flesh them out a little bit more. Then we have a whole book that gives all the details. It's called Revelation. Now, there are other books that give some details to other events that go on, like Zechariah talks about Israel beholding the one that they've pierced, talks maybe some about the military things that go on in that time with the kings and how the kings of the east will come against the Antichrist. Some of those things are mentioned in Daniel as well. But our main concern is what are the main things talked about, which is why we're going to deal with kind of those 3 key passages. So we'll deal with Daniel 9, then we'll deal with next week Matthew 24 and 25, and then we'll spend 1 week on Revelation, and then after that, we will go through a timeline of events, kind of looking at different portions of Scripture, and that could take us maybe a few weeks, and then we'll be done, and you'll all be taught, and you can go and teach everyone in the world, because you've heard everything, so you know everything. All right, so our focus tonight is going to be Daniel 9, 20 through 27, so if you want to turn there in your Bibles, we will spend a good portion here. We'll reference some other passages, but we really won't leave this at all. There really no need to. But this passage is kind of near the end of Daniel's life. And so really what's going on contextually is it's nearing the end of what Jeremiah prophesied of the 70 years of captivity. And so Jeremiah and Jeremiah 5, 2 Chronicles 36, both those places record where Jeremiah said, you'll be gone 70 years, and then you'll come back. And they're gone 70 years because they never let the land have its rest, right? So they go through 70 periods of 490 years where they were to let the land rest or every 7 years, and then they were to let it rest on the 49th year and 50th year because the 50th year was the year of Jubilee. And Israel never does that. They never obey God in that area, and God says, well, based on that, that's how long you're going to be out of the land. For every single time, every year, you were supposed to give the land rest, and you didn't, well, you're going to be in Babylon. And so God gives it very clearly in years. In 2 Chronicles 36:21, the whole captivity was predicated on not weeks of days, but weeks of years, adding up to 70 years. And that's important because when we get to Daniel, he doesn't mention years. He just says weeks. And so that's why we interpret those weeks of years, not just each individual year. Because he's not talking about 70 years, right? Here's the end of the 70 years of Jeremiah. He's giving a new thing. In 2 Chronicles 36:21, he says, at least the person recording there, about what Jeremiah had said, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. And so the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years, 70 years. And so at this point in Daniel's life, he's older. I don't want to say old because there's people in here that are over 80 years old. He's currently over 80 years old, nearing the end of the 70 years in Babylon. Babylonians have just been conquered by the Medes and the Persians. So this is right after what you see with Belteshazzar, or Belshazzar. Daniel's Belteshazzar, but Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's descendant, however many descendants that is. But Belshazzar is there, and he's conquered by the Medes and Persians. And one night, people are usually, when you conquer someone, you don't let them go. Usually you keep them in captivity, and what's going to happen is Cyrus, who is going to take charge, is going to release all the people and say, go back to your lands. So it would be unusual for when Daniel makes this prophecy for it to happen, because, again, when you conquer people, you don't tend to let them go. You tend to enslave them, especially at that time period. If you conquered people in Daniel's day, they became your slaves. That's how slavery tended to work outside of Israel and other places, is when you conquer people, you enslave them, and they do whatever you said. And so the Medes and the Persians are no different, yet God does this miraculous thing. So Daniel prays to God for Israel. God hears his prayer and sends Gabriel. And so let's go ahead. We'll read the verses here in Daniel 9, starting in verse 20. And while Daniel's praying, God sends him a messenger. So in verse 20 of Daniel 9, it says, and whilst I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, right, for Jerusalem. Yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation, right? Oblation would be sacrifice. So the time they would usually sacrifice in the evening to end the day, Gabriel comes to Daniel, and he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee. For thou art greatly beloved, therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. So God gives Daniel a vision to comfort him, which honestly, one of the reasons God gives us prophecy is to comfort us, right? So we're not wondering what's going to happen. Has God forgotten about us? Does God even care about us? No, God tells us what's going to happen, so we can be comforted that knowing that God's in control. It's all going to be okay, no matter what happens. And so he's going to kind of give the content of this in verses 24 through 27. It says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. Again, the holy city is Jerusalem. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So again, how long is this going to take? 70 weeks. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. So again, 69 weeks till the Messiah comes. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times, right? This is all going to happen even when Israel's in troubled time. They're surrounded by enemies. Again, you see this in Nehemiah's day. Nehemiah is surrounded by enemies like Sanballat and others who come against him. And after 62 weeks, so that's 62 weeks in, so the first set is, right, 7. Then you have 62 more weeks. Shall Messiah be cut off, right? And that's the same word you would have for a covenant, right? He'll be cut and then off. So dead, but in the sense of a covenant, right? So in the Old Testament, when you would make a covenant, the literal rendering is you would cut a covenant because you would cut up the animals. It's a similar phrase, but not for himself. So he's going to be cut off in the sense of death, but same kind of terminology as a covenant, but he's going to die, but not for himself. That sounds a whole lot like what Jesus did. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So there's the last week, right? He's mentioned 69 so far. There's 1 week left, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, right, the fulfillment of it all. And that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. The desolate there can be assumed to be the desolator too, right? The person who does this, God's got something planned for him. So there's a couple ways to look at that. But Daniel gets an overview of what's going to happen, and usually we call this Daniel's 70 weeks. And so usually if you hear the book of Revelation, people will call it Daniel's 70th week, because 69 weeks have happened. There's still 1 week that hasn't happened. So here's a wonderful, hopefully somewhat readable timeline of what is supposed to happen and what has happened. And so 70 weeks, each week is a period of 7 years. Again, that's why I wanted to distinguish it earlier from what Jeremiah says his is. He says 70 years. So this is not the same thing as 70 years, right? 70 weeks. 70 weeks is 70 periods of 7, right? So 490. And God uses this all throughout Scripture to designate time. Some people will look at this and say, well, it's 70 time periods, right? 70 complete time periods. And those are the people who tend to, I would call them liberal, but I wouldn't say they're all liberal. But a lot of them are. And they tend to view this fulfillment to be when Joshua the priest and Antiochus and the Seleucids and all these things are going on, as these are the anointed and these things happen. But it doesn't fit any of the timelines that God says. And if it doesn't fit in the timeline, then it doesn't fit, and it can't be that. But amazingly, Jesus fits very well in the timeline to the day. And so a command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem happens in, I believe it's either 445 BC or 435. I always get my numbers wrong. But right around there, you see that in Nehemiah chapter 2. The king sends Nehemiah, says, rebuild the city. And so that happens under Artaxerxes in his 20th year of his reign. He starts reigning in 465, so before 45. And that starts the time period that Daniel talks about, from the command to rebuild and restore Jerusalem, right? Its walls, its roads, all the things that are going on. And Nehemiah is the one given that command. Ezra is given a command to go rebuild the temple, but he's not really given the command to rebuild the city. Nehemiah is the one who's really the one given the command to rebuild the whole city. And so there was a man by the name of Sir Robert Anderson in the 1800s who took this literally. He was made fun of for taking it literally. And he said, well, it has to be fulfilled to the day. And so he did all his time things and noticed in Revelation that when John talks about years of time, John talks about a year as 360 days, right? So if you read the time periods there, he'll say for a time and a time and a time. I think it's 1,260 days, something like that. Whatever it is, it's 360 times 3.5, right? And so he says that's 3.5 years. And he gives the days, and then he says it's 3.5 years. And so how do you take that? Well, that must be how John is presenting a year. So he takes the same time period, he imposes that in Daniel's prophecy, and amazingly enough, it takes you from 445 BC to 8032, right at the Passover, to the very day. You know why? Because we know the exact day that Artaxerxes gave his decree, because it's a historical record. And when you take all those days and you add them up, and you have 483 years from then, for those prophetic days, it gets you to the exact day Jesus died. Amazingly, right? Somehow by chance. By the way, our oldest copy of Daniel was written about 100 BC that we currently have, and its copy has basically most of the book of Daniel in it, and so much so even liberals will say, oh yeah, the Masoretic text is authentic and everything in it is correct. And again, why would the Jews, if they thought this talked about Jesus, why would they keep it in there? Right? Because again, the Jews were the ones that preserved the Old Testament for the church, right? All the way up to the 1500s until it was printed. So again, if you have that for 1,500 years after Jesus lived, and their oldest copy of Daniel is at least 100 BC, and if you're not so conservative in your dating, probably closer to 300 or 400 BC, closer to when Daniel wrote it, again, you have an authentic thing that happens hundreds of years before Christ is born that talks about him coming and dying to the very day. And so if it was right about that, maybe it's right about other things. And so as we go through the content of this, again, he mentioned 70 weeks for kind of a 5 or 6-fold purpose there. He says to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And so most of those things have happened. But again, it doesn't all happen until the 70 weeks are fully done. So he says to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity. That sounds a whole lot like what Jesus came and did, right? Christ comes, transgression is done with, right? He says it is finished, it is completed, it is paid. He makes an end of sins, right? We are now righteous in him. He makes reconciliation for iniquity. Isaiah talks about that, right? By his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and God hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. And again, he is to make peace for us. Isaiah talks about that as well. And so that first half list sounds a whole lot like what Jesus did. And the second half of the list sounds a whole lot like what Jesus will do, right? Bring in everlasting righteousness. Has that happened yet? No. Is everyone doing righteous things all the time? No. By the way, this shows, too, that it cannot be what happened in 167 BC. Why? Because the Jews were not righteous people after that, okay? So he's supposed to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, right? To finish it all, right? To seal up the vision and prophecy. All visions, all prophecies will be done, be completed. Has that happened? No. So it's a future event. To anoint the most holy. And again, the most holy, while you could look at that as the most holy place, meaning the temple, you could look at it as Christ, too, to set him up as king. Again, is Christ king now in a way? Yes. But is he ruling his kingdom yet? No, but he will be what? Anointed. The most holy one will be anointed to rule on his throne, right? God says to him in Psalm 2, sit here till I make your enemies your footstool, right? There's coming a day when Christ will come, he will reign. And his reign is not just for 1,000 years, right? We get a glimpse of the first 1,000, but his reign is forever, right? We sing that song because it's based in Revelation. He shall reign forever and ever, right? Because his reign is not just 1,000 years. And so when it comes to these periods, the first 69 weeks, well, they've happened because the Messiah came and he was cut off, like it says again in verse 26. After 62 weeks, shall Messiah be cut off, right? The anointed one, right? He's going to die, but not for himself. Again, sounds a whole lot like salvation. Christ doesn't die because he was a sinner. He dies in our place, right? Because we're sinners. And so he dies not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Guess what happens after Jesus dies? Jerusalem's destroyed, right? The people of the prince that shall come. He doesn't say the prince that shall come, the people that are associated with him. Again, there's a reason that people who study prophecy look at what goes on as some sort of Western revived empire, right? Daniel prophesies that, by the way, in his prophecy of the image, right? The head is gold, the chest is brass, the legs are iron, maybe it's the shoulders are brass, and the whatever it is. The chest is silver. Brass, the stomach is brass, thank you. I knew I was missing part of the body, and I couldn't remember which part. And the legs are iron, right, because that's the Roman Empire, and the feet are iron mixed with clay. By the way, part of the iron mixed with clay, they're going to come together, but they're really not together. In fact, when you read the book of Revelation, you see the armies of the East are going to come against the Antichrist, because you're going to have a global coalition, but they're really not going to be that tight-knit. It's a very loose coalition. And there's going to be a lot of issues the whole time the Antichrist tries to reign. But with all of it, though, it's really a Western thing. Again, you read, people will say, well, I don't think America's in Revelation. Well, it's not mentioned, but I guarantee you America will be just as part of the Antichrist kingdom as anybody else. Again, it's all the Western groups, right? And that's kind of what Rome was looked at, was this Western empire, right? That's the West, and you have the East. And that, by the way, the world has almost always been looked at that way. Even today, we have the West and the East, right? We look at that with even Russia and the Soviet Union and China and all those things, right? You have the allies of the West and of the East, right? We've always looked at the world that way. And so even in that day, that's why people will talk about a revived Roman Empire. Why? Because the people that destroyed that city was Rome. And one day, Rome will be some semblance of itself, seemingly, and do it again. One of the biggest things that happened was when the European Union was formed. Because Europe had not been united in 1,000, 1,500 years. Basically, since Rome fell, Europe has no ties to each other. And after World War II, right around the 90s, the European Union's formed. And everyone's like, well, Britain's not part of that. Well, Britain wasn't really part of the Roman Empire either. Understand, they conquered Britain during a lot of the stuff that was happening in Christ's day. And so, again, all those things are set up to happen again, to basically, the people of the prince that shall come are going to be the ones that are going to do this. and it's all being set up again to basically do the same thing. And so, what you have ultimately at the end of this, you have Daniel's 70th week, right? Because this is what's yet to happen. The first parts happened, right? The Messiah came, Jerusalem was destroyed, right? And it says the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war, desolations are determined, right? Everyone in Israel fled. Israel was a desolate place when it happened. And by the way, Israel's been a desolate place since 1948. In fact, what's interesting is if you read some of Isaiah's prophecies and others, it talks about Israel becoming a place that's no longer desolate again. And if you look at pictures from before 1948 of certain places, and you take pictures of the same places today, there are cities there. Because Israel's not desolate anymore. But it was desolate until what? Well, the time's going to happen again when it's going to be rebuilt, and then God's going to do this. And so what happens is it was desolate for essentially 2,000 years, right? People did not really permanently live there. Some did, but not really. And what's going to happen is verse 27 is kind of our key verse for Revelation, and Matthew 24 and 25. That's basically the whole tribulation in one verse. He, who, the prince that shall come, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So what's going to happen? Well, this prince will confirm a covenant with God's people. And not just God's people, but with many too. So you can even view it as kind of everyone, right? We're all going to agree for 7 years kind of idea. And by the way, I'm sure the world would love that, right? We're all going to get along for 7 years. Now, it's assumed that part of that covenant obviously deals with Israel, because Israel seemingly is going to view this person as their Messiah in some way and be fooled by him. And so this person that will come, he's going to confirm his covenant with many. You could include the nations in that, but it's usually assumed to be Israel. And so when people ask, well, when does the tribulation start? It does not start when the church leaves, okay? It starts when this covenant is confirmed, right? When the covenant is signed, that's the day it starts. And so this covenant is signed for 1 week, 7 years, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So what's going to happen? Halfway through, what we call the abomination of desolation occurs. And so we'll talk a little bit about the abomination of desolation in a minute. But he's going to do this in the temple. Now the implication is, if they already ceased before, because he says that, right, in verse 26, right, the sanctuary and the city is destroyed. How do you have sacrifice without a sanctuary? So what's the implication? If you had a temple that was destroyed, and you have to have a temple to sacrifice, what's the implication? You have to rebuild a temple. By the way, Israel's about a year and a half away right now from having their sacrificial system reinstituted. They have 9 priests that they keep locked away that are ritually pure to do a sacrifice. And those 9 priests are going to sacrifice a bunch of red heifers in about a year and a half, because the red heifers have to be 3 years old, and they're a year and a half at this point. So in a year and a half, guess what they're going to start doing? Israel's going to start sacrificing again. They have like 7. They only need 1, though, so their odds are pretty good. So here's where Christians like to make prophecy happen. It was a guy in Texas. It's always be some Texan that would make the Bible happen. And so a guy in Texas started breeding red heifers. Israel found out about it and said, we want to buy your red heifers from you, because Israel has a red heifer born once every 100 years. And you have to be able to breed red heifers to have them for the sacrificial system. And so a man in Texas started breeding them about a year ago. They were old enough to be transported to Israel. But the thing is that by the time they're 3, they can't have any blemishes. They can't have any miscolorings in their hair. Right? Everything about them has to be perfect. So they sent 7 over because they figure, well, by then, the Muslims wouldn't have killed them all. And also, well, we'll at least have 1 that'll meet the requirements of sacrifice. And we have 9 priests who are pure enough to start the sacrifices to do it again, and to purify everybody else who needs purified to do sacrifice. And so that's kind of their plan right now. And so they have a spot of land on the Mount of Olives, because the implication is in Jesus' day there was some sort of thing that went from Jerusalem at the temple to the Mount of Olives, because the Mount of Olives is where they would do, they did like one sacrifice for purification of the priests out there, and that's where they would sacrifice the red heifers. and they would take the ashes back, and then they would purify their priests, because that was part of what was required in Leviticus. If you read the book of Leviticus, Moses talks about the red heifer and using those things. And so, interestingly enough, when people say Israel will never have a sacrificial system again, in a year and a half, they will have a sacrificial system. And by the way, they're going to do it whether or not they have a temple. Now, for them to have a temple, though, they already have everything ready for it. They have the altar built. They have all of their candlesticks built. Their table of showbread is built. They have everything ready for it. Well, they have it at the Jerusalem Museum of the temple. Everything's already been rebuilt, handmade. Everything's there. All of the material for it's all ready. They already have everything cut and ready for it. They just got to take it there and build it. And by the way, it's not a big building. The temple's probably not even, might be from here to the exit sign. Maybe a little bit longer. Maybe here to the doors to the baptistry. That long, maybe. It's 90 feet long. It's about 30 feet wide, and it's 45 feet tall. It's not a big building. That's probably the size of a decent-sized house. No. But if you do it based on Solomon's temple and the dimensions of Solomon's temple, it's 90 by 30 by 45. So it's not a huge building. When I lived in Pensacola had a 6,000-seat auditorium called the Crown Center. It took them 1 year to build the Crown Center from foundation to finish. And the Crown Center had a foundation that was 60 feet deep, and it was all concrete poured, and it's all glass. And on the inside is 6,000 seats and bathrooms and everything else. It took them 1 year. I don't think it's going to take them very long to put up some wood and stone that they already have cut and ready. You know what they got to do? They just got to take it there and put it up. And so whenever they decide to do that, it's not going to take long. It might take a couple months, if that, because they really want to build their temple. And all the furniture's already made. It's just got to be moved. And so you can see how this wouldn't take long. So Israel, by the way, does not even have to have a temple before Christ comes. Because the point is just by the midpoint, they have to have sacrifice. Not that they have it right now, but they have to have it by the midpoint for it to stop. So again, it wouldn't take long to build a temple. It wouldn't take long to start the sacrifices. And by the way, again, within a year and a half, we will have the sacrificial system restarted in Israel. And they already have the Sanhedrin. They already have 70 men who work as the Sanhedrin in their government. All of those things are all set up. And the world looks at the Bible and says, well, that's just a bunch of fibs and lies and stories, and it's not. Right? Everything that God said is coming into place. And so, in the middle of the week, right, sacrifice and the oblation will cease. Again, sacrifice is what they would do. The oblation was their daily sacrifices, right? Those daily things are going to stop. Why? Because the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, right? Whoever this is going to do something so abominable, something so wicked, they will never be able to sacrifice in there again. Like, it's my personal belief that the temple they build will be so polluted, Christ will build his own. Because Ezekiel 38 through 48, you see the Messianic temple, and the Messianic temple is huge. It's absolutely huge. And I kind of assume that Christ will build his own. He doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. He'll make his own. And so take that however you will. Maybe that's an extrapolation a bit. But when you look at it, whatever he does is so abominable, they can't do anything in that place. And it says this will be this way until the consummation, right, the fulfillment of it all, the end of it all, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. And so, and again, you can view the desolate as the land and everything else, right, when God's done with his judgment. So, what ends up happening with this abomination of desolation is, really we should ask, well, what is it? If this is something that happens, what is it? It's an important question, because there's differing views out there. Again, historically, the Jews look at this as Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes was a man who was really full of himself. In fact, he goes by Antiochus the Fourth. He loved himself so much, he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes because he thought he was so high and mighty. Basically, it was this great one, this enlightened one, this idea of I'm so great, I'm so enlightened, I'm so smart and intelligent. He has a very high view of himself. He gives himself a nickname, by the way. So you can imagine, like if I nickname myself Joshua, the most intelligent being in the world. That's essentially what Antiochus does. And the Jews end up making fun of him for his pride. Yeah, they changed the name slightly to basically make it seem like the guy was an idiot. And Antiochus doesn't like that very much. You have to understand, too, during that time period, you have the Hellenizers. Hellenizers aren't people who are sending people to hell, okay? Hellenizers are people who are trying to give Greek influence to the culture. And so in that time period, you have the Hellenizers who are Jewish, a lot of them even, and they don't want the Jews to be Jewish anymore. Well, we want to be Greek. Look at the Greeks have brought. Look at the prosperity. Let's be Greek. And the Hellenizers, basically, not only because Antiochus is a little upset because of how the Jews treated him, but the Hellenizers really were the ones that convinced him to make it illegal to sacrifice to anyone but Zeus. And so Antiochus, because of the Jews and really the Hellenizers, enacts a law saying you will not worship anyone or sacrifice to anyone but Zeus. And so what ends up happening is Antiochus Epiphanes, when the Jews don't, he raids Jerusalem, he takes some pigs, he kills them on the altar, and he wipes the blood all over the temple. And for a Jew, pigs are the most unclean animal that you could ever have. And he desecrates the temple. And so what? Oblations cease, right? The sacrifices cease. Everything stops. And so for a period of even a few years, this is going on. And then the Maccabees, which if you read First Maccabees, which is a historical account, by the way, that's part of the Apocrypha. Not everything in the Apocrypha is bad. There are historical accounts of things that occur, and those things aren't bad to read. And so in First Maccabees, you see how Mattathias and others, they go and they conquer the Temple Mount. It's a historical event. Josephus records it. It's recorded there. And they go back, and when they conquer the Temple Mount, they decide they're going to cleanse the temple. And so as they cleanse the temple, part of what they pray for is for God to give them enough oil to light the lamps, right? And they have to light all the lamps, and they really don't have enough oil, and they pray, God, just light the lamps. And what does God do? Well, all the lamps are lit, and they stay lit. And what is that called? Hanukkah. Hanukkah, in the book of John, he celebrates the Feast of Dedication, because what were they doing? They were dedicating the temple back to God. And so, again, Antiochus Epiphanes wanted them to worship Zeus, forces the Jews to worship him, and if they didn't, he killed them, and he did. He would send armies through and kill them and kill whole villages, and they would bring in an image of Zeus and say, you're going to worship him or we'll kill you. And that's when one of the Maccabee boys decides to kill the person who says that. And that's what starts the Maccabean revolt and everything else that leads up to the dedication. So the Jews refer to this event as the abomination of desolation, all the way up till the time of Christ. And a lot of historians and others will look at it and say, this is the abomination of desolation. Now, was it an abomination of desolation? Yes, it was. But a lot of prophecy in the Bible isn't just that event. It points to the greater fulfillment, right? It's like a taste of what really is going to come. And that man did something that was a taste of what was to come, and it's not going to be as bad as what is coming. Right? It's just a taste of what's coming. It's the same reason all of us in our lifetimes, we can look at an individual and think, oh, I could see how he could be the Antichrist. He did this and this. And the point is, yeah, he's a type of Antichrist. John says very clearly, there are now many Antichrists in the world. People that are like that. And it's supposed to make you think, wow, if they how bad the actual Antichrist is going to be. Right? And when you see stories about Adolf Hitler, everybody thought Adolf Hitler was the Antichrist. Look, everybody in World War II, Adolf Hitler's the Antichrist. Adolf Hitler was not the Antichrist. But he was a type of Antichrist, and if you thought Hitler was bad, the Antichrist is going to be much worse. What's interesting about the Jews and all these things, one of the things that God tells the Jews is if they would not serve him, he would not multiply their children. The Jews really haven't gotten above 60 million in population very often. In the stars of the sky, is he going to stop them from populating? That's one of his blessings. By the way, large families are a blessing. Christians should not look at large families as a curse. Look at him as Catholic, yes. They must be Catholic or Mormon, one of the two. Definitely not evangelical or Protestant. All right, so all these things happen because God is giving a taste of what's coming. And that's the whole point. It's all a taste of what's coming. What's coming is much worse. Because what's coming is someone who's going to do this until consummation. Again, the consummation is the completion of all things. Has all prophecy for Israel happened yet? No. And again, they do have sacrifice again. They have it in the Second Temple period. They have it until Jesus' day. and then it stops again, which makes it seem more that, again, the way we view the 70 weeks and the 69 weeks is that what happened with Jesus is verse 26, and verse 27 is yet to happen. And so these things happen. People assume that the Maccabees and all these things fulfill this. Again, the Maccabees cleanse the temple after this event, so worship can be restored. Jesus goes and celebrates the Feast of Dedication in the book of John, celebrates and remember Jacob Maccabeus rededicating the temple, lighting the oil for 7 days, and the Jews still do this today. Prophetically, though, this event is yet to happen, right? When we say historically, it's not that this event was that. It's like that, right? It's like what's described, but it's not everything that was described. It's not everything that was described. It's not even close to everything that was described. And so in Matthew 24:15, Jesus makes a shocking statement to his disciples. By the way, his disciples are Jewish. I don't know if we think that often when we read the Bible. These people are all Jewish. They know God's word, and so when they hear these things, it would probably shock them. Matthew 24:15, Jesus says, "When ye there shall see," and by the way, he's speaking to a Jewish audience, not just his disciples, "when ye, the Jews, therefore, shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place." What do you mean, shall see? Jesus, this happened in 167 BC. I'm sure they said 167 BC because, before Christ. This happened, almost 200 years ago. Don't you know? Haven't you read the Maccabees' history? Don't you know, Jesus? This happened almost 200 years ago. What do you mean, shall see? Yeah, the Jews believed that the abomination of desolation was what happened with Joseph Maccabeus. And yet he says, "When ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place." Again, for a Jewish person, what do you mean, shall see? This has already happened. But it's not already happened. Because Jesus is talking very clearly about an event that is coming in the future. Jesus mentions the abomination of desolation will stand in the holy place and the temple, right? After the event of what happened prior to his birth, which means it's still to come, it's still to happen. And it will occur in the holy place, right? Which means what? Since Jesus mentioned holy place, right? I get Daniel only mentions the oblation and the sacrifice, but Jesus mentions what? Holy place. So it's not just that the sacrifice is restored. That's happening in a year and a half. Right? The sacrifices will be happening again for the first time in 2,000 years. And then what's going to happen? There's got to be a holy place. Why? Because where is this person going to stand? In the holy place. And then 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4, we get more information about this event. There Paul tells them, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." So, I want to clarify, talk about a falling, talk about it again when we talk about the rapture, but falling away comes from the word apostasia. Apostasia doesn't have to be a bad thing. That gets the word apostasy from it. Apostasy to us is always a bad thing because we always use it in a bad context. But words mean what they mean in their context. Apostasia just means a departure. So, when you think of the rapture, you think of a departure, right? Can it mean moral departure? Sure, but he doesn't say that there, though. In 1 Timothy 4, or 2 Timothy, or 1 Timothy 4, he does talk about those that depart from the faith. And so that would be a moral departure. But here he just speaks of a general just departure. He doesn't describe what it is. And so there's this event that's going to happen, and contextually, if you read 1 Thessalonians, the book he just wrote to them, not much earlier, he speaks there of a big departure, doesn't he? 1 Thessalonians 4, right? The Lord himself shall descend from heaven with the voice of an archangel and the shout of God, trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. And we which are alive and remain shall be caught up with them to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Again, there's a departure he just told these people about, because the Thessalonians have every book of the Bible in the world with them, probably at this time. Probably not. So what do they have? They have the first letter Paul gave them. They have the second letter Paul gave them. He's talking about a departure. What are they probably thinking of? The rapture, right? 1 Thessalonians 4. So that day shall not come except there first come a departure, right? This departure event, this thing that's going to happen. Right? So my defense to you, by the way, is the rapture precedes the man of sin, the Antichrist. His revealing anyways, not his existence, but his obvious revealing. Yes. And he says, in that man of sin be revealed, perdition, right? The son of destruction. So what happens after the departure? Well, this man of sin is revealed. He's made known. It's obvious. Now, I don't know if it'll be obvious to the people on the earth necessarily, but for those of us that are watching, probably very obvious. By the way, I think we are watching because John was watching and everybody was cheering him on and cheering on God. So I think we'll all be watching. So this person, the Bible describes this man of sin as one who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So what's this man going to do? He's going to stand in the holy place like Jesus said. Paul says he's going to sit in the temple and act like he's God, to be worshipped as God. By the way, in the Holy of Holies, and this is why I think it's so important that we understand how the furniture in the temple works, the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat there was not just some vile bowl or something that they just poured stuff in. The mercy seat was a throne. Again, you go to the mercy seat for mercy, right? Esther, in the book of Esther, does what? She goes to the mercy seat to the king to beg for mercy for her people. The mercy seat is where a king would sit, right? That's why the priests would carry it as a throne, right? The poles would go through. They would carry it as a throne because the Ark of the Covenant is not just a place with a little vial on top that you see in Indiana Jones, okay? I get we watch Indiana Jones and we think, well, this is what the Ark of the Covenant looked like. Or we see artist renditions. The Ark of the Covenant likely was shaped like a throne. Again, because who sits on the seat of mercy? The king, who can give mercy. By the way, same thing's mentioned in Hebrews. We come to the throne of grace that we might find mercy. Right? God's throne is described as a place of mercy. And so what's he going to do? He's going to basically set up a throne for himself in the temple and say, I am God. What's Jesus going to do? Jesus is going to come back and say, no, I'm God. Get off my seat, right? That's my seat. And by the way, we know it's Jerusalem and the Mount of Assembly. So unfortunately, let me give this little explanation here. In Revelation, when you see the final battle, and you see things about the Valley of Megiddo. How many of you have heard that, right? The Armageddon's at the Valley of Megiddo. You've all heard that? It's a misunderstanding of the transliteration that comes from Harmageddon. Harmageddon. It never says Valley of Megiddo in Revelation. It just says Harmageddon. It says Armageddon, but har is on the word there. In the Greek, we just don't put it in there because who cares about how stuff is pronounced? And so we say Armageddon. And people assume because it says Armageddon, oh, that must be the mountain, because Har is mount in Hebrew, and Megaddon, it must be the Mount of Megiddo. But by the way, if you go to Megiddo, it's not a mountain, it's a valley, right? So kind of the opposite, isn't it? So in Hebrew to Greek, you have two consonants that can be the G sound. You have a gimel, which is where you get Megiddo from, or you have an ayin, which would give you the word ma'od. We don't use guttural sounds today because we would sound like we were choking or throwing up. And so we don't use those sounds today, but in Hebrew, and if you go to Israel, they still use those sounds. But English speakers, we don't do those sounds because it probably make us want to throw up. And so we use normal sounds. We use eloquent sounds. They speak like crazy people. We speak like educated people, okay? So yeah, they're probably right. We're probably wrong, yes. And so what you have is you have a transliteration thing, because when you're translating from one language to another, you give letters that sound like those other letters. Well, Isaiah, Satan says something. He says, I will ascend into the Mount of Assembly. That's Jerusalem. That's the temple. Satan says that in Isaiah 14. I will be like the Most High, right? I will sit where God sits. I will be worshipped as God is worshipped. The word for there is Har Ma'od, which, by the way, is the same transliteration as Armageddon. The issue is not that Armageddon was wrong. Armageddon's right. The issue is we don't understand what we're reading because we're really bad at transliterating things and realizing how language works. And so where this happens is Jerusalem. So when you see that all the armies are gathered in Revelation at Armageddon, they're all gathered at Jerusalem. And the armies of the east come against the Antichrist armies at Jerusalem, and they all see Jesus come, and they say, let's kill him instead. And it doesn't go very well for them. because they all lose. And Christ splits the mountain open. By the way, that's how you get the reconciliation. If you ever have an atheist come to you and say the Bible's wrong, you can clearly show them how stupid they really are. Because what they're saying is just stupid. It's just they don't understand what they're reading. And the point is not to make them feel stupid. The point is to make them realize you don't realize what you're reading. Maybe think through it some more before you throw it out. So this person is going to do this. Same thing prophesied in Isaiah, this man of sin, ultimately controlled by Satan himself. So this man of sin will set himself up and demand to be worshipped by God. And then he will set up the temple as a place of worship for himself instead of for the true God of heaven. Because again, he wants worship. And then in Revelation 13, this same event is described. So again, we had our main points. We had Daniel 9, and it had like this one phrase, right? He'll make it desolate. Well, that's nice. Matthew, Jesus says, he'll make it desolate and he'll stand in the temple. 2 Thessalonians gives a little bit clearer, even though it's not all about prophecy there, but he'll say, he'll make it desolate and he'll set himself up to be worshipped as God. And Revelation 13 kind of gives the final description where it says, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And so again, it's like he looks right, but he's not, right? 2 horns like a lamb. Who is the lamb in the Bible? Jesus. Who does this man look like? He looks like the lamb, but he speaks as a dragon. Who's the dragon in the Bible, in Revelation? Satan. So he looks like Jesus. He speaks like Satan. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So again, this person, which is the false prophet, by the way, I should clarify that here. Again, he looks like Jesus. He speaks like Satan, and he's lifting up the one who really is Satan and who is acting like Jesus. Because again, the point is all these people look fake. They present themselves as something they're not. Look at who's really speaking through them. And he exerciseth all power of the first beast before him, causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Again, that's why we assume that they worship the first beast. Again, what you have in Revelation, you have Satan, you have what we would call the Antichrist, which is the beast, you have the false prophet. It's 3 people, right? For Christians, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. You have Satan. You have this beast who looked like he died, and now he's not. Sounds like a resurrection, doesn't it? Yeah, it's the Holy Trinity. And it's it's like a fake thing going on, right? He's mimicking everything God does, right? This guy's dead, now he's alive. Worship him. And then you have this one that tells everyone to worship him, called the false prophet. And he doeth great wonders, right? Miracles. So that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. That would make people want to worship, wouldn't it? And deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword, and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here's wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So this beast will have an image of himself created, demanding worship by people worshiping his image, or they'll die. The assumption is that whatever this image is, they make images of it, and they make everyone worship it. Is everyone going to come to Jerusalem to worship? Probably not. They're probably going to make images in a lot of places and set himself up as the God of the world. And you're going to worship him. By the way, Amazon just started doing this, not to have a mark in your hand. Amazon, now at their stores, because they do have regular stores you can go to, and by the way, they'll overtake Walmart in the next 10 years. Walmart will be a thing of the past in 50 years. Okay? Guarantee it. So Amazon has a thing now where when you check out and also to check in, all you have to do is just scan your hand right over a thing. Not those hand scanners you see from the movies, not that. You just wave your hand over it. and it knows all the details of your hand to know this is Josh Corbin. I know his credit card information. I know that he's an Amazon Prime member. I know everything about him based on just a picture of my hand. And by the way, you don't have to have a chip implanted to have a mark. Okay, I know in the past we're like, oh, we'll implant chips. They just need to take a picture of your hand. They don't need to put anything in you. Because they already have enough technology, they can just take a picture of it and say, yep, that hand is Josh Corbin, and he does have the mark, so he can come in. And, oh, he can spend his money too. Because all my credit card information, I don't need something in my hand. All they need to have is all the details of my hand to know this is Josh Corbin. They just started using those. So all the technology is there for however the Antichrist wants to do this. I hope you understand that. And then what happens is halfway through the tribulation, this is ultimately what this event is. The Antichrist will set an image of himself up in the temple, demand that the Jews worship him. And it's kind of a compilation of all those together. So that's an abomination of desolation. Daniel 9 itself gives a good glimpse of the whole tribulation in one verse. And then next week we'll look at Matthew 24 and 25, which will give us some good details of what Jesus says will happen in the first half of the tribulation and the second half of the tribulation. And then we'll read the book of Revelation in one week. We won't read the whole thing, but we will overview it and see, again, kind of the details of what God says. Because God gives a lot of detail there, and it's important to see those details because even though we might not be here for it, the point of it is, again, it's to comfort us, just like he comforted Daniel. Daniel's upset. Daniel's worried. What's going to happen to your people, God? You said 70 years. We'd be gone. We'd be out of here. And now this country takes them over. What's going to happen? And he says, these are for your comfort. He tells them, yep, you're going to rebuild the city. These things are going to happen. The Messiah is going to come. What a greater comfort than for an Israelite to hear their Messiah is coming. And so same thing for us. God tells us these things are going to happen, and the Messiah is going to come. And what a greater comfort for us than to hear that our King is coming. And so these things are written for our benefit. All right, any questions? Does it make sense? Yeah. Well, and I used that in a paper. Well, the teacher didn't like it, but I liked it. He said I talked past the theo. I was talking to a bunch of humanists that lived 300 years ago. One of the papers I had to write. This was like a month. This was at the Ark when I was writing that research paper. It was a nightmare. And I used it as one of my defenses because my thesis was really about how miracles and prophetic events prove the Bible's accurate. And he said because I was dealing with it, I had to go argue with Enlightenment people. Because the teacher I had for that class has his PhD in theology. So he wants me to argue with people who are theologians, even though they're not Christians. And apparently I talked past them. But my points were still good. I just talked past them. So he didn't like that. And I still got an A in the class. Did not get an A on the paper, though, because he was mad at me. But I used that as an argument in my paper to show God's word, especially Daniel, the oldest copy is 100 BC, at least. It shows the Masoretic text is authentic. And it prophesies to the day when the Messiah would come when we know Jesus lived. How could you, as an Enlightenment humanist, speak against that? Because the thing with the Enlightenment crowd is they didn't believe in miracles. Miracles aren't true. Prophecies aren't true. It's all a bunch of hogwash. Now, they lived before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. So 150 years later, the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered, proving Daniel is completely authentic. No one corrupted it. No one changed it. It says the same thing before Christ was born as it did after Christ was born. And they didn't get to live to see that. So I guess I did kind of talk past them because how could I argue with them in something they couldn't know? But they're dead anyways. And I don't like arguing with dead people because they can't say anything. Which is why I'm not doing a theology degree. I'm doing Bible exposition because I don't have to argue with dead people usually. So yeah, so it's important. You can use it as an apologetic to an atheist. How can an atheist even explain that? Especially because it's historic information. You can go look all that stuff up. It's in academic journal articles. People who are academics say, oh yeah, oldest copy is this, and it proves the Masoretic text is authentic. The Masoretic text, by the way, is what our Hebrew Old Testament's from. Right? The Masoretes copied the Bible for 1,500 years until the printing press came out, and then Jacob ben Chaim in 1536 decided to compile that. Jacob ben Chaim was a Jewish man, and he wasn't even a Christian yet when he did it. He ended up getting saved later, but because he was Jewish and not Christian when it was done, And he was a Christian after it was done. Both the Jews and the Christians accepted his printed edition of the Hebrew Old Testament. And so it's the Hebrew Old Testament that both Christians and Jews used for 400 years. But he did it from the Masoretic text. And again, it shows that the Masoretes didn't mess with the Bible, because the accusation in the 1800s, late 1800s, right before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, was, well, the Masoretes must have corrupted the text because they're Jewish and they hate Christians and we can't trust them. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found out the Masoretes were more honest than some Christians were, right? They really did keep a good copy of the text. And so they didn't corrupt stuff on purpose, and they did a good job. So we can trust what we read. Plus the fact that if the Jews were the ones that preserved Daniel 9, why wouldn't they change it if they thought it would talk of Jesus? By the way, they leave Isaiah 53 in their Bibles. And Isaiah 53, they're not even allowed to read without being in the presence of a rabbi to explain it to them. And so if they left all those things in, they have a high regard for what the Word of God says. They're not going to change it, which shows it's not been changed. And it's been saying the same thing for a long time. And an atheist can't speak against that, no matter how hard they try. And Bart Ehrman can't either, who is an atheist, and he's the professor of New Testament studies at Cambridge University. Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman. Yeah, he is on the fast track to hell, unfortunately. And he hates God, hates the things of God, and somehow he's the one teaching the New Testament at Cambridge. And he's the lead professor there. It's just amazing to me. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Hawkins. Yeah. It's sad. And Bart Ehrman is that place. Amazingly, a lot of those people are Jewish, but he's not Jewish. No, he is. He's British, and so yeah. Bart Ehrman, he's debated people that would defend the authenticity of Scripture, like James White. Now, James White would not agree with me on my Bible, on my translation choice, but James White has debated a lot of people like that to prove the Bible is accurate, and it's more accurate than any other ancient document you can come up with, because that was one of his arguments with Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman thought he was debating an idiot, so Bart Ehrman didn't even prepare for the debate. And James White had listened to probably 30 Bart Ehrman debates and all his arguments and compiled notes to debate him, because that's what you're supposed to do when you debate people. And he did, and he came to him, and his first thing was, well, the New Testament, it's so inauthentic, and it was written hundreds of years after it happened, which isn't true, by the way. Our earliest copy of John, and John was the last gospel written, is 125. AD 125. That's the earliest extant copy. And by the way, to have a copy of the gospel, which were very popular at the time, to still be alive and existing today is a miracle. And it's 125 AD, and we assume John wrote that in maybe 80, maybe close to 90 AD, right around when he wrote Revelation. It could be earlier, depending on how you take that, but still, within a couple decades, we have the earliest copy of the book of John. And it's not the whole book of John, but the fact that you have a portion shows that it exists, and it still says the same words on that page that we have today. So it doesn't just exist that whatever we have is accurate of at least that portion. And the earliest copy of it have of any other classical writing is 1,500 years later, right? So 20 years is a whole lot closer than 1,500 years. And to say it's inaccurate after 20 years, when you're going to trust the Iliad and the Odyssey and all these other ancient writings that are 1,500 years, seems really silly. And Bart Ehrman agreed and said, well, those are really, really, really bad then, and wouldn't give up his argument because he realized that what he had said was stupid and didn't want to admit it. So, but he has chosen to blind himself, unfortunately, with all the information in the world. So, any questions? Mm-hmm. The first 7 weeks, or the first, yeah. The 7? Yeah. It's 62, 7, and 1, yeah. The assumption is that either if you take Ezra's time, that's between Ezra and Nehemiah finishing the wall, which, by the way, if you take that time too and you take the 365 years, you take the 365 days, it still gets you to AD 33. So whether Jesus died in 32 or 33, if you agree with Sir Robert Anderson with the exact date or agree with somebody else saying it's Ezra's day instead, if you're within a year, you're not my enemy. you're my best friend because you at least agree that it's accurate. So either you could take it as Ezra to Nehemiah, or just by the time all the stuff was done, right, to finish everything. The other thing is from the initial command of Cyrus to Nehemiah's day, and the other set is in fact, I think that's what it is. It's the 430 some years, whatever it is. You have from Cyrus's command to Ahasuerus' command is like 49 years-ish, and then you have the last set, which is what gets you to Christ's day. I think that's what it actually is. Does that sound right? Looking at Aaron. He knows the same Sir Robert Anderson arguments, but I have to look. But I think that's what it is. I want to say it's Cyrus's initial command to Nehemiah's command and finishing. 49 years. Yeah. And then from that to Jesus is the other 62 weeks, which if you take the prophetic years, still gets you to 32. I think that's right. Sounds right. I have a chart somewhere. But the point is it's exact. Everyone agrees it's exact, unless they're a liberal, in which case they don't. They say, well, it was fulfilled by the Maccabees, even though the dates don't match, and it's okay. Right? So I'd rather much stay on the side of accuracy and saying, yep, it's a miracle. And there's no other way to put it. And if God's exact in that, he's going to be exact in his tribulation period too, and the dates and the times and all those things. Any other questions? All right. What's at least one thing we can do with this? Prophecy is not always the list of things. I won't ask for 3. It's not as application focused. But what's one thing we can do with it? One way we can apply it. We can comfort people with it, right? If God meant his message as a message of comfort for Daniel, God means his message of Revelation and Matthew and all these portions that might seem so terrible as comfort for us. They're there to comfort us and to show us God hasn't forgotten about us. God's going to do what's right. God's going to make sure that his son returns and reigns and all those things. God's going to keep his promises. And if God kept his promises to Daniel and the Messiah came, just like he said, well, God will keep his promises to us, and Christ will come for us, and we'll be with him forever too. All right. Well, we'll be done. Yep. I mean, even the destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, people could try to claim that Matthew is written later, but everyone agrees Matthew's one of the earliest Gospels. Even liberals agree that. And again, Jesus said it before it happened. And said, no, not one stone. And you have no stones of the temple left anywhere. They don't even know where the temple was. Right? They might claim they think it's on the Temple Mount, but they couldn't even tell you where on the Temple Mount they think it was, because they don't know. They have no clue. Mm-hmm. They're hoping to put it on the Temple Mount, because that's where all the Jews thought the temple was. Now, it's based on, so Constantine, when he becomes a Christian, right, it seemingly seems to be very advantageous when a lot of people are Christians that all of a sudden he's a Christian and the whole Roman Empire is, when he's having issues. Now, I don't know his salvation. He could have been a Christian. He might not have been. Now, he does syncretize a lot of things. That's why you start to have candles in the church, right, wax candles instead of oil, because the pagans worshiped with wax candles. So what does Constantine do? He brings in pagan worship to make them all feel comfortable in church. By the way, today, what do people do? Let's make everyone feel comfortable in church. It's no different. So Constantine does that. It's called syncretism, right? Mixing worship of God with pagan worship to make pagans feel good. And so he does that. But he sends his mother on a pilgrimage to Israel, and she goes and she meets a bunch of nomads. Again, this is like AD 400. Right? So this is still a few hundred years after the events. Even in America today, I could not list every area that Lewis and Clark landed and everything else. No one could, right? You wouldn't even be close. It would just be, well, we think this is where it was. We think this is where this was. We don't know. And it's only been 200 years. And in Jesus' day, Constantine's mom, a few hundred years later, goes and says, where was Jesus born? And the people that live there, and by the way, it's basically a desolate area. Not really that many people live there because Rome destroyed it to the ground. And they salted the whole land so nothing would grow. Okay? So it's just a desert place. And she goes and says, where was Jesus born? And she knows it's Bethlehem. So these people take her to Bethlehem and they say, oh, it was right here. She pays them some money, right? And so what do? They build a church there. That church is still there today. So everybody goes and says, this is where Jesus was born. Because Constantine's mom was told so by a nomad, and she paid him some money. And then, where did Jesus die? Oh, this big area here. And by the way, at that point, it was a trash heap. That's where they kept all their trash and burned their trash. Was what we call the Temple Mount today. And by the way, the Temple Mount is 99% the dimensions of a Roman fort. And the Romans always built their forts the exact same way everywhere in the world. People want to say that they didn't build it the exact same way in Jerusalem, even though they built it the exact same way everywhere else. And she gets up there and they say, this is where the temple was. Now, do they know? No, they're not even from the area, right? These people aren't even Jewish. The Jewish people have been taken out and scattered. And the Jewish people that stayed, they end up at Masada and they commit suicide. And so you have people who don't actually live there, aren't actually from there, say, this is where it was. And by the way, how could they know where it was when the Romans burned it to the ground and there was nothing left? They wouldn't have known. The Romans, though, did have a fort there called Fortress Antonia. Fortress Antonia, Temple Mount is 99% of the dimensions of a Roman fort, and the only wall standing that was associated with the temple today has Roman coins found at the base. By the way, the base is where you start building. So if you find Roman coins where you start building something, who built it? Probably Romans. And the Jews are so convinced it's the temple wall that you can't convince them otherwise, and they're going to try to build their temple there. I don't think that's where the temple was. I think that's where Fortress Antonia was. Because Fortress Antonia would have, it had the 9th Roman Legion, about 5,000 soldiers. 5,000 soldiers could not live in the model. Well, they couldn't live in a model anyways, but they couldn't live in the model description, even if it was life-size, of what they give to Fortress Antonia. You might be able to fit 400 soldiers in there. For the Temple Mount, you could fit an army of 5,000 plus all your markets, because the Romans aren't going to go to the same markets as the Jews. The Jews won't even go into the same house as a foreigner. So you're going to let the Romans in your markets? No. They're going to have their own markets. They have to have their own places for all of their debauchery, right? Because they are men away from home, and they're going to have basically a whole city. And that area is big enough to hold the 9th Roman Legion, or maybe it's the 10th Legion, whichever legion, 5,000 soldiers plus a whole group of people to supply what they need. And then you would have the temple probably not far off, because Josephus actually speaks of the Romans. He says their fort made the temple look small. But what scholars do, because scholars are so smart, they say Josephus was an idiot. He's right about everything else, but not this. Even though Josephus saw it, he watched it be burned to the ground, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. So, yeah, gotta love scholars. They're very consistent. Hence why they all keep saying Harmageddon. It took a guy that's now dead. He died a few months ago of pancreatic cancer. Was the first person that ever said Harmageddon was Harmaod, and here's why. And he's right. He's completely right. But you have all these scholars that think they know Hebrew so well, know Greek so well, and the more you listen to them, the more you realize they know about as much as I do. And I don't feel like I know a whole lot either. But they want everyone to listen to them. That's the problem. They got to sell their books. All righty. No, I don't know. That probably wouldn't go very well. If people listened to me, they would take clips of me, put them on the internet, and say this guy's a heretic, and he's going to hell. Because that's what Christians tend to do with their own, unfortunately. I've watched it happen one too many times. See, people do it with John MacArthur, too. That's why it scares me if people ever got a hold of my stuff, because he at least writes his stuff out verbatim, so he doesn't make a mistake. And I say things that are slightly off sometimes, and people come to me after church, and like a couple weeks ago, I said, all of the apostles died for Christ, and someone said, well, John wasn't technically martyred. I said, okay, you're right, but he still suffered a lot of things for Christ. I think John would have wished he was martyred after what happened to him. And I said, I said it to be quick, not to be precise. And so I'm sure if someone got a clip of that, they would post it on Facebook and say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And he doesn't even know that John was whatever, not realizing why I said it the way I said it, was just so I could move on very quickly. Otherwise, I would have had to sit there and explain for 2 minutes as to why John didn't include himself in that list. And sometimes you just got to move on.